I want you to picture a classic, Hollywood World War II movie. The exact kind I mean.
Oh, definitely. There's the valiant British protagonist fighting tyranny.
Right, standing up to the Axis powers like some sort of modern knight. It's a deeply inspiring, super familiar image. But the research we are unpacking today drops a really stark and honestly deeply uncomfortable counter-narrative right at the start.
Yeah, it really does.
It argues that the massive financial cost of that heroic war and just the industrial bedrock of the West in general was actually extracted by breaking the backs of your ancestors or those in the global South, and that it was funded entirely by the multi-century plunder of the Indian subcontinent.
It is an incredibly heavy way to start. And we really need to be super clear about our parameters right up front. Today's deep dive is focused on unpacking a single, highly charged historical document about the East India Company.
Yeah, and it's important to note, this material presents a rigorously aggressive anti-colonial viewpoint.
Exactly. Now, we are not here to endorse political conclusions or take sides. Our mission is purely to impartially unpack the fascinating arguments, the financial data, and, well, the specific historical framework this author presents. We want to understand the cold, calculated mechanics of how a private corporation managed to subjugate an entire subcontinent from this distinct perspective.
Setting the stage like that is so crucial because normally when we talk about a startup, we picture like a couple of kids in a garage building a software app.
Right, we think of venture capital and ping pong tables.
Yeah. But we are looking at a startup that literally conquered an empire. It's just mind-boggling.
It really challenges our entire modern conception of what a business can even be. And to understand how this corporate behemoth grew, we actually have to look at the economic conditions of 1599.
Okay, 1599.
Yeah, the catalyst for the largest corporate takeover in history actually had absolutely nothing to do with India at all.
Right? It was entirely about pepper.
Yeah.
Black pepper was so incredibly valuable back then, they called it black gold. But the global spice trade was tightly monopolized by the Dutch, who essentially controlled all the supply chains flowing into Britain.
Right.
And then, in 1599, the Dutch decided to aggressively flex that monopoly power by just raising the price of black pepper by 5 shillings per pound.
Which was a blatant, devastating corporate squeeze. I mean, British merchants were furious at being priced out of their own market.
Yeah.
So 24 of them gathered in London, deciding they just had to break the Dutch stranglehold by launching their own independent spice trade.
Wow.
They managed to convince 125 shareholders to pool their money, raising 72,000 pounds.
Wait, hold on. 125 shareholders for an international maritime fleet. That sounds like a massive logistical and legal nightmare for the 16th century. You couldn't just build armed ships and sail into contested global waters without state backing.
You couldn't. Which is why, on December 31st, 1599, Queen Elizabeth I granted them a royal charter. This is really where the structural reality of this company takes shape. Think of a modern industrialist walking up to a head of state asking for permission to run a shipping lane.
Okay.
And the government says, sure, and by the way, we're going to let you mint your own currency, write your own laws, establish your own courts, and, oh yeah, maintain a private standing army.
Okay, let's unpack this. That is the ultimate sovereign power handed directly to a private joint stock company.
Oh,
Because it was a joint stock company, those shareholders sitting comfortably in London weren't out there braving the seas or dealing with the locals.
not at all.
They just invested capital and expected maximum dividends.
Yeah.
It baked this one uncompromising objective into the company's DNA from day one: maximize profits at all costs. Ethics, local diplomacy, human lives, those were entirely secondary to the profit mandate.
And we see that ruthless calculus immediately in how they staff their operations.
Right.
Finding a crew for these incredibly dangerous, disease-ridden voyages wasn't exactly easy.
I can imagine. Normal sailors probably wouldn't take the risk.
Exactly. So they essentially treated human beings as disposable assets. The document details how they sourced their early laborers by literally emptying out Newgate Prison and pulling inmates from the Bedlam Asylum.
That is, wow. So armed with this desperate, fractured crew, they set sail. But they didn't go to India. Their eyes were fixed entirely on the Indonesian spice trade, specifically the Maluku Islands.
And that initial venture was an absolute disaster. The Spanish, the Portuguese, and especially the Dutch, who had their own massive, heavily armed corporate entity, were already deeply entrenched there. The English were completely outmatched, both militarily and financially. They were utterly crushed and just sent packing.
This is where that Silicon Valley analogy really hits home for me. because this is a venture capital-backed startup whose initial product launch in Indonesia is just an absolute, undeniable failure. They are bleeding cash. So to appease their shareholders and avoid bankruptcy, they're forced to pivot to a brand new market. So they pivot to India. But they bring this terrifying, move fast and break things mentality with them. Except, instead of software bugs, they are backed by a heavily armed private military.
Yeah, and that pivot in 1608 changes world history. They send a diplomat named William Hawkins who drops anchor at the port of Start. But he isn't walking into some fractured, fragile nation. He is walking into a global superpower.
The Mughal Empire. I mean, if you're listening to this on your commute right now, try to wrap your head around these numbers from the source. The Mughals controlled almost the entire subcontinent. They were producing 25% of the entire global economy.
It's massive.
By modern standards, that is a $21 trillion economy. They manufactured everything. I mean, words we use in every day in pajamas, khakis, cummerbund, those became global vocabulary simply because Indian textiles absolutely flooded the planet.
Yeah, to put it in perspective, if you combine the economies of every single European nation at that time, India's economy was still vastly larger. So when Hawkins arrives, he's a representative of a relatively poor peripheral nation trying to get an impromptu meeting with the CEO of a titan.
And Hawkins embarrasses himself completely. He travels to Agra to meet Emperor Jahangir. He dresses up in traditional Afghan attire, tries to speak broken Turkish, and offers these genuinely cheap Western gifts. Jahangir essentially laughs him into the room, gives him an Armenian Christian wife as a parting gift, and just sends him away.
Total failure.
Total failure.
But, the company learned fast. They realized cheap theatrics wouldn't work on a highly sophisticated state. So by 1615, King James sends an official royal diplomat, Sir Thomas Roe.
And Roe was very different, right?
Oh, completely. Roe was sharp, calculating, and pragmatic. He stripped away the theatrics and used cold economic logic. He laid out the immense, quantifiable financial benefits the Mughal Empire would get by trading directly with England, and he offered a fixed annual sum directly to the treasury.
And that logic actually worked. Jahangir issues a royal decree, a Shahi Farman, allowing them to establish coastal trading posts in places like Surat, Madras, and Bombay.
What's fascinating here is Roe's explicit advice to the company directors back in London. He warned them that the Mughal military was an immovable object. Pushing inland or attempting to use force would be corporate suicide. He told them to stick strictly to the coast, buy cheap, and ship back to Europe. And for decades, they followed that blueprint perfectly.
But corporate restraint never lasts forever, right? We jump to the 1680s in Bengal, the company's getting wealthy, and corporate arrogance fully kicks in. There's this executive, Josiah Child. The local governor of Bengal raises the trade tax from 2% to 3.5%.
A pretty standard tax hike.
Exactly. But Child flat out refuses to pay. He actually threatens the governor. And in 1686, he orders 19 warships and 600 soldiers to attack the Mughal Empire.
It was a catastrophic miscalculation. Emperor Aurangzeb possessed a military machine that absolutely dwarfed the company. His forces retaliated with overwhelming ferocity. They crushed the company's army, seized their factories, and completely shut down their operations. Decades of careful investment were just wiped out in an instant.
The imagery the document provides from this specific event is so vivid and humiliating, the company realizes they are facing total ruin. Those previously arrogant British executives spend years literally groveling on the floor before Aurangzeb, begging for mercy.
Yeah.
Finally, in 1690, the emperor pardons them, but he slaps them with a massive 150,000 rupee fine.
And that humiliation forced a complete strategic reset. They learned a brutal lesson. Corporate bravado crumbles instantly when faced with true state military power. They realized they could never win by force as long as the central Mughal authority was strong.
So what did they do?
Well, what do you do when you can't muscle a titan? You wait. They became obedient traders, quietly expanding their warehouses, waiting for the empire's unified strength to inevitably rot from the inside.
And that patience paid off. In 1707, Emperor Aurangzeb dies, and the empire begins to fragment into regional powers. By 1717, an East India Company surgeon manages to cure the new emperor, Farrukhsiyar, of a painful illness. Overjoyed, the emperor grants them something called the Dastak.
Yeah, the Dastak was the golden ticket. It was a free trade passport that exempted the company from all local customs and transit taxes across Bengal for a meager flat fee of 3,000 rupees a year.
It was essentially a license to print money, but the company abused it, using it for their private side hustles. By 1756, the independent Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, had had enough. He saw the company evading taxes, building heavy unauthorized military fortifications, and harboring political traitors.
So he took action.
He did. He marched on Calcutta, captured the company's base, and locked the British workers in a tiny, unventilated dungeon overnight.
This becomes known as the Black Hole of Calcutta, where the majority of the captives suffocated. It sent shockwaves through the corporation. For a century, they had relied on flattery and waiting. Now they faced a regional monarch who was willing to completely dismantle their infrastructure.
So the company unleashes Robert Clive. But Clive looks at the Nawab's massive army and realizes a fair fight is just out of the question. He needs an inside man. So he utilizes ruthless espionage. He identifies Mir Jafar, the Nawab's top military commander who secretly covets the throne, and Jagat Seth, a wildly wealthy local banker.
Right, the financial backer.
Exactly. Clive orchestrates a massive bribe. Jagat Seth finances the operation, and Mir Jafar agrees to commit treason on the battlefield.
This conspiracy culminates in the Battle of Plassey in 1757. And the battle itself wasn't some tactical masterpiece. It was largely decided by basic operational discipline and weather.
A torrential downpour hits the battlefield. The highly disciplined British soldiers immediately cover their gunpowder with tarpaulins. Siraj's forces simply don't. Their weapons are ruined in the mud. Mir Jafar sees this vulnerability and orders his troops to retreat, completely abandoning the Nawab. Siraj is defeated, and Clive installs Mir Jafar as the new Nawab of Bengal.
Plassey is really the turning point where the East India Company establishes its core corporate doctrine, which is never rule directly. By installing a puppet like Mir Jafar, the company forced the state to rewrite trade policies entirely in their favor.
Right.
They controlled the wealth, but the puppet king was left with the expensive, tedious burden of daily governance, infrastructure, and dealing with public unrest.
It's the perfect crime. The company extracts the cash, the puppet absorbs the blame, and the source points out this is precisely the era when the word loot was taken from the Hindi language and entered the English dictionary, specifically to describe British actions in India. They even slapped Bengal with a staggering 3 crore rupee war indemnity fine just for resisting.
But the puppet king's strategy had a fatal flaw. Eventually, those puppets realized they were being bled dry. When the regional nawabs finally tried to coordinate a unified resistance to take their power back, it triggered the Battle of Buxar in 1764.
The Nawab of Bengal, Awadh, and the Mughal emperor teamed up, but their coordination was terrible, and the highly disciplined British army crushed them. The result was the 1765 Treaty of Allahabad, which granted the East India Company the Diwani rights.
And the Diwani rights changed everything. This wasn't just a trade monopoly anymore. This gave a private corporation the exclusive, absolute legal right to collect all land revenue and taxes across the massive wealthy provinces of Bengal, Bihar, and Odisha.
Here is where the material uses a deeply unsettling analogy. Imagine a modern, private highway toll company taking over your local government.
Okay.
They triple your property taxes, pocket every single dollar for their shareholders, and when the local roads start to crumble, they tell the citizens, hey, civic repair is the government's job, not ours.
Yeah, and the real-world consequence of this structure was devastating. In 1770, a natural drought struck the region. Now, a normal government responds to a drought by suspending taxes and distributing emergency grain. Because the company was purely profit-driven, they did the exact opposite. They refused to offer a single rupee of tax relief.
It's horrific. The document says company tax collectors forcefully extracted quotas from starving survivors with absolute brutality while hoarding all the remaining grain in their fortified warehouses. They drove the prices up intentionally to protect their margins.
And the result?
Between 7 and 10 million people starved to death.
It's a staggering loss of life. And the wealth extracted from that suffering funded a rapid, brutal expansion across the rest of the subcontinent. They utilized their massive new financial reserves to fund proxy wars, hire vast mercenary armies, and dismantle any remaining opposition.
They took down the Kingdom of Mysore and Tipu Sultan. And Tipu wasn't just some local king. He was a modernized technocrat with French military allies. He fought back hard. So the company used their endless capital to bribe his neighbors, invaded his territory, took his 2 young children as political hostages, and demanded half his kingdom.
Wow.
When Tipu fought to the death, the company looted over 2 million euros worth of pure gold from his treasury.
They systematically broke down the Maratha Confederacy and the Sikh Empire as well. Not just with better guns, but by using the tax revenue of Bengal to financially outspend their rivals. They essentially bought out enemy commanders and funded internal civil wars. And for states they couldn't conquer militarily, they invented a purely bureaucratic mechanism in 1847 called the Doctrine of Lapse.
I want to spend a second on this because it shows how deeply they manipulated local culture for profit. Explain how the doctrine of lapse actually worked.
Sure. So, in Indian legal and religious tradition, if a ruler didn't have a biological son, adopting an heir was a deeply sacred duty. It was essential for performing funeral rites and ensuring dynastic continuity. The company simply decided to invalidate centuries of religious and legal tradition.
Just like that.
Just like that. They declared that if a ruler died without a direct biological male heir, any adopted heir was legally void.
So they literally just erased the local laws of succession, declared the kingdom lapsed, and absorbed the real estate into their corporate portfolio. That's how they swallowed massively wealthy states like Awadh and Jhansi without firing a single shot. It was total calculated domination.
But, absolute power corrupts absolutely. This systemic plunder began to create a structural rot within the company itself, and it severely infected their home country's political system.
Right. Executives like Robert Clive went back to England with unimaginable astronomical wealth. They were known as nawabs, and they used that plundered cash to literally buy seats in the British Parliament.
It was brazen.
They were buying MPs to manipulate national laws in favor of their corporate monopolies. Eventually, the British government realized this private corporation had grown larger than the state itself. It was a national security threat.
This realization really culminated in the Government of India Act in 1858. The British Parliament completely dismantled the East India Company. They transferred every territory, every military asset, and every tax system directly into the hands of the British Crown. The corporation was swept aside, and the formal British Raj began.
So what does this all mean for the big picture? We know the history, but the financial math is what really anchors this deep dive. The research references the rigorous historical calculations of the Indian economist Utsa Patnaik. She concluded that the East India Company and the subsequent British Raj systematically drained an astronomical $45 trillion from India over 200 years.
It is a number that almost defies comprehension.
I genuinely have to push back here, because when I first read that, I thought the math had to be a typo. I mean, $45 trillion. The entire UK gross domestic product today is only like $3 trillion. How is an extraction of that magnitude logically or mathematically possible according to the source?
It's possible because it wasn't just simple theft. It was a brilliantly terrifying closed-loop structural scam. The company created a 100% profit loop by setting up two distinct interconnected departments. One department ruthlessly collected land taxes from Indian farmers, often tripling the traditional rates using violent enforcement.
Okay, so they squeeze the population for massive tax revenues. Where does the second department come in?
The second department was responsible for purchasing trade goods. They took the tax money they had just extracted from the farmers and used that exact same money to, quote-unquote, buy agricultural goods and textiles from those very same farmers.
Wait, so they didn't actually bring any British capital into India to trade. They used the victim's own money to buy the victim's own goods.
Precisely. And then they exported that cargo back to Great Britain to be sold at a massive markup. Over centuries, every single shipment of goods sent to England was essentially acquired for free. The Indian farmer was completely funding their own subjugation.
That is just incredible.
This mass transfer of wealth left India with zero capital reserves to industrialize or build infrastructure. Meanwhile, that plundered wealth financed the construction of railways, factories, and really the entire industrial revolution in the West.
And the text points out the financial drain didn't stop at infrastructure. The history shows that every global war Britain fought, including World War I and World War II, was financially dumped onto India. The British categorized military expenses as national debt owed by India to the Crown, which they then used to extract even more interest. The modern scars of this massive bureaucratic extraction are still incredibly visible today. Even now, the highest district administrative officer in India is called the Collector, a title explicitly coined for the agents ruthlessly extracting those corporate taxes.
It structurally rewired the society. The only native individuals who managed to accumulate significant wealth during this era were a tiny elite class who acted as willing, corrupt middlemen for the British. The text argues that the foundations of many prominent historical business houses today were built entirely by facilitating this corporate plunder.
It is an incredibly heavy history to process. But there is a strangely poetic footnote to all of this. In the modern era, An Indian entrepreneur named Sanjeev Mehta actually walked into London and bought the entire East India Company, lock, stock, and barrel. The corporation that once deployed warships, wrote its own laws, and extracted trillions from a subcontinent was transformed into a quiet luxury brand selling high-end tea and coffee in London.
It's a fascinating, almost ironic conclusion to their specific timeline. But stepping back from the historical details, exploring this material raises a vital, unscripted question for us today. The East India Company was a private corporation that achieved quasi-state powers. It wrote its own laws, maintained a private military, and operated with absolute impunity across international borders, driven purely by the mandate to maximize shareholder value, regardless of the human cost.
Which, when you frame it like that, sounds uncomfortably relevant.
Exactly. When we look at the architecture of the world today, we see massive transnational tech monopolies wielding unprecedented control over global data. They control our public squares, and they aggressively lobby to influence local legislation to protect their margins. They may not have wooden warships, but their leverage is immense. Are we risking a modern digital version of this history repeating itself?
That is a profound thought, and one that will definitely stick with you long after you take your headphones off. The line between a multinational corporation and an empire might be significantly thinner than we like to think. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Stay curious, keep questioning the narratives, and we'll catch you next time.